No mai, haere mai. Welcome to the Maxim Institute podcast. My name is Jason, and I'm the Communications Manager at Maxim Institute. This is our weekly short-form podcast. These podcasts are released in tandem with our weekly column and are a chance for you to hear in depth from the column's author about some of the thinking that went into producing their final piece. Today we talk to Maxim researcher Thomas Scrimgeour about his recent column. Thomas, welcome back to the podcast. Good to have you.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
No worries. We are talking about your latest column for Maxim. How will we remember them? Now, this is obviously in reference to Anzac Day, which happened recently, and you talk about how it's got a significant place in our, pantheon of public holidays in New Zealand. Why don't you just expand on that for us a little bit? How's it so different?
Yeah, so I was thinking last Anzac Day, sitting there wondering about how Anzac Day feels different to some of our other public holidays and the way we celebrate as a nation. You know, Christmas and New Year's are kind of celebrations, people spend time with family, but other than that, there's sort of no common way of celebrating them. You know, Waitangi is quite contentious because of the political history of this country, and fair enough, it's a time to have something of a national debate about our national history and how we live that out now. You know, Matariki is fireworks, it's the middle of winter, it's the new public holiday. And King's birthday weekend, you might mock your Republican friend, but otherwise, you know, it's all just a public holiday.
If you really don't want a monarchy, why don't you go to work then?
Exactly that. I think if you're a Republican, work on King's birthday weekend. And if you oppose unions, maybe you have to work Labor Day. It's a fair exchange. You get one of them, but, you know. I guess going on to Anzac Day, it has this kind of solemnity to it. It's a very sincere kind of holiday. It's hard to commercialize. Gallipoli was an incredibly tragic, failed campaign in a world war. And so we remember that as a nation. We can't beat our chests at how tough we are because we lost. We can't sell you cheap discount barbecues because it seems a bit crass. And so all we have in Anzac Day is this remembering of the war and those who gave their lives. So it's quite different to other public holidays. And
it's interesting how you mention in the column how people often say we don't want to politicize the holiday or we want to be unified around this Remembrance Day.
Yeah, I mean, so thinking about the most recent Anzac Day, a number of fountains, public fountains around the country were dyed red by protesters talking about the war in Gaza. And the criticism of that was people were politicizing this. It should be a time for unity. There was this sense that among some commentators that protest was inherently inappropriate, that this was a time for unity. And I wasn't sure how I felt about that. I think in general, most people in the country didn't pay much attention to the protests. They weren't significant. But I thought trying to shut it down purely with a story of unity was problematic in some ways.
And so you have an ambivalent relationship with this concept of unity. You confess in the column. Draw that out for us a little bit. Why I guess you say it's a double-edged sword. Why is that so?
Yes, in the column I talk a bit about my great-grandfather. And so he lived during the First World War. He was conscripted. New Zealand had conscription at the time. Australia didn't, interestingly. So it's a kind of a difference in the Anzac story. But my great-grandfather was conscripted into the war, and he objected. He was a part of a small independent Christian church, and he felt that his beliefs meant he could not go and fight in the war. And so he appealed in the court, in the military tribunal. He appealed his conscription. And on Anzac Day, I was reflecting on this and reading, there's a digitized newspaper column recording his trial. And the headline of that column talks about his unreasoning beliefs. And in that column, it records the tribunal lead asking him if not his beliefs seem a little ridiculous. And so I was thinking of, the harshness that unity can have in certain contexts, that we can look back to a time when we were more united as a country, but that wasn't straightforward and not everyone had a positive experience of that unity. Now, it turns out the end result of that was that my great-grandfather went to the war as a medical orderly, served at Passchendaele and was injured there and returned home and lived a long life. And it's that kind of emotional complexity that I think is really moving about Anzac Day, that we tell these stories with uncertainty about their moral legacy. But yeah, unity becomes this thing that we can talk about. The decline of unity is a really good story, and it's an important one we should wrestle with, but we shouldn't lionize unity. It has a dark side as well.
Especially, I guess, if it's imposed from the outside because of an emergency, right? We all have to unite around, sending our soldiers overseas to fight in a war, or we all have to unite, most recently, the call for unity around combating COVID-19. But if it's forced on you, there's going to be some people who are not happy with that. And I guess out of that comes this question of, if we're not going to unite around, or if we're trying to find unity outside of emergency situations, what's the story, or who are we? How are we going to find that unity?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. Thinking again of Anzac Day, we tell a lot of stories about how those who went and served were sort of victims of a world, and they went and died at the course of these systems. And in some sense, that's a true story. We think of my great-grandfather. He did not want to go to that war, but he was sent. But many other people, many other Anzacs, saw something they thought was worth fighting for, and they went. They believed in an idea of a nation.
And I think that you'll find as well many stories of people who volunteered willingly, and some even lied about their age to get in to the conscription or to the army to go and fight. So it goes both ways, doesn't it? There are people who are like, no, I don't want to go, and others who, I can't wait to go.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we can have real disagreements among ourselves about each of those positions and to what extent those decisions were right. But I think we have to weigh the fact that a number of people believed in an idea of a nation and thought that was something worth fighting for. And I kind of was confronted with the question this Anzac Day, well, what is my idea of New Zealand? And do I think that it's actually something that would be worth protecting? And I think I was kind of struck with the pointy end of that question of uncertainty. And then why was I uncertain? And so I think when it comes back to the idea of unity, do we have a unified vision of who we are as a nation? I think quite understandably, some of our old national myths about, say, a racial cooperation have kind of fallen apart in recent years, and probably fair enough, that needed to be subject to critique. But what could we build as a national story that would actually be worthwhile and inclusive for all people? And I'm not sure we have the answer.
But we should at least have a discussion about it.
I think so. I think we need to kind of continue to try and narrate a story of New Zealand that we can believe in, that we can think is bigger than ourselves and might call on us some sort of obligation.
Well, you also note that the world is changing in your column, that the world is more volatile, and maybe that the story is forced on us again from external sources.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's not an original observation, but slowly I think New Zealand is waking up to the fact that we aren't safe just at the end of the world, and that foreign policy isn't something we ever talk about. It's notably absent from most of our elections in recent history. But Winston Peters went to Gallipoli as our foreign minister, and he spoke, and it was Foreign Minister Winston Peters, who has this gravitas and seriousness that sometimes campaign Winston Peters doesn't.
Yeah.
But he was speaking, and he said, "We live in a troubled world, the worst in memory." And I think there's something to be said for that, that the kind of post-Cold War consensus is certainly falling apart. And so now we have these kind of discussions that are slowly emerging. Should New Zealand join AUKUS? What is the state of our military? And again, there's no easy answer to what we should be doing. That's not what the column is about. But we have to ask this question, well, what is it about New Zealand that we actually want to preserve? And how do we continue that on for another generation?
Big questions, Thomas. Thanks for taking the time to talk about them with us.
Thanks for having me, Jason. New Zealand Defence Force contingent in Gallipoli now in good position to carry out roles. Stuff News tempted fate last week in the lead up to Anzac Day. Such optimism has served us poorly on that particular peninsula. Aside from lost luggage gate and services cancelled due to the Wellington wind, the Anzac commemorations passed without major incident. We remembered the dead, honoured the living, and pondered the future of our national myth. Anzac Day has a significant place in our national calendar. Christmas and New Year are for partying. Waitangi is an argument. And Easter is for the beach. Matariki is for fireworks, and King's birthday is for mocking Republicans. But Anzac Day has maintained an earnest solemnity that is somewhat out of place. The Gallipoli campaign was such a disaster that it is hard to turn it into a day of jingoistic chest-thumping. Likewise, foreign policy is typically so far from the minds of the New Zealand public that there is not much to get political about. Across the country, fountains were dyed red by protesters opposing Israel's actions in Gaza. But for the most part, the protests were ignored. There was the usual chiding about disruption, making the day political, and calling instead for unity. I'm somewhat ambivalent about unity. National unity can be extremely unforgiving. My great-grandfather, Thomas Scrimgeour, was a conscientious objector to the war on religious grounds. He appealed his conscription in court, lost the case, and was mocked by the Military Service Board and in the newspaper. We were a unified nation, and everyone would be made to agree. In obedience to his country, Thomas Scrimgeour served as a medical orderly, returning home after being wounded at Passchendaele. The emotional complexity of such stories is what makes Anzac Day such a remarkable occasion. We remember those who made the ultimate sacrifice, the strangeness of a stable world, and we worry about the fragile future of peace. It also poses the question, what is New Zealand? Would I be willing to die for that? Anzac Day is not an exercise in dispassionate history, but a collective work of memory. Historian Rowan Light draws out this distinction. The work of history tries to understand the past on its own terms. The work of memory, however, uses the past to make sense of our present. At Gallipoli, Winston Peters spoke with gravity, drawing heavily from Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Yet, we cannot hallow these grounds. The men who died here have already made sacred the ground upon which we come, every 25th of April. He went on, we live in a troubled world, the worst in memory. Peters didn't have to name names. New Zealand is slowly waking up to the state of global tensions, and so once again we may have to ask the big questions. What is it about our nation we believe in? What did it cost to achieve? We must continue to wrestle with our national history. Only by sustained reflection on our past can we look with resolve towards an uncertain future.
Thanks for listening to the Maxim Institute podcast. If you'd like to hear more from us and keep up with the rest of our research and analysis of politics and policy in New Zealand, you can sign up on the homepage of our website to get our monthly forum email and invitations to future Maxim Institute events. You can search and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. From the team at Maxim, mā te wā, goodbye for now.